The streets of New York City were merciless in the dead of winter. The wind howled between the towering buildings, cutting through the layers of even the best-dressed pedestrians. Snowflakes swirled under the dim glow of streetlights, collecting in gutters, freezing on park benches. The city never slept, but for those with nowhere to go, the night was long and unforgiving. On a deserted stretch of sidewalk, hunched against the side of a boarded-up storefront, a homeless man sat shivering. His body was wrapped in layers of ragged clothing, none of them enough to fight off the brutal cold. His bearded face was gaunt, his hands trembling violently from a mix of hunger and freezing temperatures. Next to him, half buried under the snow, a cardboard sign leaned against the wall. The letters, nearly smudged away by ice, read, "I lost everything, and people like you don't care." Just a few feet away, a black SUV rolled to a stop at a red light. Inside, Barron Trump sat in the back seat, dressed in a sleek navy blue winter coat, his sharp gaze drifting over the scene outside. He had seen homeless people before. This was New York, after all. But something about this man made him pause. Maybe it was the words on the sign. Maybe it was the way the man's jaw clenched, even as he shivered uncontrollably. For a brief moment, Barron considered looking away, ignoring it like everyone else. But something in him wouldn't let it go. "Pull over." The driver hesitated. "Sir, it's freezing out. We should pull over." Barron's voice was firm. With a slight sigh, the driver eased the SUV to the curb. Before he could even say another word, Barron was already opening the door. The cold hit him like a slap. The wind cut through the street, sharp and relentless. Snow crunched under his shoes as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his breath forming a thin mist in the freezing air. The homeless man didn't even look up. He was too busy trying to keep his hands from shaking. Barron took off his warm, expensive coat without a second thought. He stepped forward and held it out. "Here," he said, his voice steady. "Take this." The man finally stirred, his bloodshot eyes lifting slowly. His gaze flickered over Barron, then at the coat, then back at him. And then he scoffed. A dry, bitter laugh escaped his cracked lips. "Oh, this is rich," he muttered. "A Trump, handing out charity? What, am I supposed to clap? Say thanks? Make you feel good about yourself?" Barron didn't move, didn't react. He just kept holding out the coat. The man shook his head. "You rich kids," he coughed violently, shivering as he pulled his torn hoodie tighter. "You throw a few bucks or a jacket at us, and suddenly you think you care. Suddenly you're the good guy." Barron still didn't say a word. The man scoffed again. "Save it, kid. People like you don't do anything unless there's something in it for you." The wind whipped against them, the cold digging deeper into their skin. But Barron didn't leave. "Just take it," he said simply. The man hesitated. His fingers twitched, as if some part of him wanted to refuse on principle. But the coat was thick, warm, untouched by the snow. His teeth chattered so hard his jaw ached. After a long, tense moment, he snatched the coat from Barron's hands and pulled it over his frozen body. He muttered something under his breath. It wasn't exactly gratitude. "Whatever," the man grumbled, adjusting the coat. "Not like this changes anything." Barron didn't argue. Didn't ask for a thank you. He just stood there for a second, watching as the man wrapped himself in the warmth. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the SUV. He didn't expect a thank you, but what happened next, he never saw coming. As Barron turned away, the cold air biting at his face, he expected the conversation to end there. He had done what he could. The man had taken the coat, even if he had done so with nothing but bitterness. But as he reached for the SUV door, he heard a voice behind him. "Wait!" Barron stopped. The homeless man had spoken. He turned around slowly. The man was still sitting against the wall, but now, instead of just clutching the coat, he was studying Barron carefully. His fingers twitched as if debating whether to say more. "You really just gave this to me?" The man asked, his voice still hoarse, but with something different in it now. Not anger, not resentment, something else. "I don't need it," Barron said simply. "You do." The man let out a breath, one that almost sounded like a laugh, but not a mocking one this time. He looked down at himself, the coat now wrapped tightly around his thin frame. For the first time all night, he wasn't shaking. "Thought you Trumps only cared about yourselves," he muttered. Barron narrowed his eyes slightly. "Maybe you don't know as much about us as you think." The man blinked. He wasn't sure if it was the wind making his eyes sting or something else. He coughed, rubbing his hands together inside the warm sleeves of the coat. "You're not what I expected," he admitted finally. Barron shrugged. "Neither are you." The man let out another breath, this time not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "My name's Alan," he muttered, almost reluctantly. Barron gave a small nod. "Barron." "Yeah," Alan scoffed. "I know." There was a moment of silence. Just the wind, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Then Alan shifted slightly, adjusting the coat. His expression was unreadable. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think people like you never even saw people like me. Just walked past, looking right through us." Barron tilted his head. "Maybe some do." Alan exhaled, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Not you, though." For the first time that night, his voice didn't sound so bitter. Barron didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he took one last look at the man wrapped in the coat he had given him, the same man who, just moments ago, had treated him like the enemy. Then, without another word, he turned and stepped back into the SUV. As the car pulled away, Alan sat there, watching, his fingers tightening around the warm sleeves of the coat. He didn't say thank you, but somehow it felt like he didn't have to. The SUV moved slowly through the snow-covered streets of New York, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows across the pavement. Barron sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the window, watching as the city blurred past. He should have felt nothing. He had done what he came to do. He hadn't expected a thank you, hadn't expected anything at all. And yet, something about that encounter stuck with him. Alan, a man who had nothing yet somehow still clung to his pride like it was all he had left. Barron leaned back against the leather seat, exhaling slowly. "Sir?" The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Are you all right?" Barron hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, just thinking." The driver said nothing more, focusing on the icy roads ahead. Meanwhile, back on the sidewalk, Alan sat motionless, staring at the retreating taillights of the SUV. For the first time in years, he felt warm. He pulled the coat tighter around himself, his hands disappearing into the thick sleeves. The expensive fabric was unlike anything he had worn in years, maybe ever. It smelled clean, felt heavy on his shoulders, a reminder that it wasn't his. And yet, the longer he sat there, the harder it was to take it off. He scoffed to himself, shaking his head. Rich kids got no idea how the real world works. But even as he muttered those words, something inside him felt off. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had seen him, not just as another forgotten soul on the street, not just as a statistic, as a person. He ran a hand through his graying hair, letting out a slow breath. This didn't change anything, right? Then why did it feel like it did? Alan sat against the brick wall, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, but this time, not from the cold. The thick fabric of Barron's coat insulated him against the brutal New York winter, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it was just a jacket, nothing more, nothing less, but it wasn't. He clenched his jaw, staring down at his worn-out boots, his mind battling itself. Why did it bother him so much? Maybe because it had been so long since anyone had given a damn. Not just a passing stranger tossing the dollar into his cup out of guilt. Not just a cop telling him to move along. Not just someone looking at him like he was part of the scenery. Barron Trump had stopped. A kid who had everything, who could have driven past without a second thought, had stopped. Had looked at him, spoken to him, given him something without expecting anything in return. Alan scoffed, shaking his head. Damn kid. He pulled the coat tighter, hating how much he liked the warmth. A week ago, he had ranted to another homeless guy about how the rich didn't care, how they only used people like him to make themselves feel better. But Barron hadn't asked for a picture, hadn't asked for recognition. He had just given and walked away. Alan's fingers tightened around the edge of the coat. His body still shivered slightly, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. It was from something else, something he didn't want to admit. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. Alan sat there, staring into the dark street ahead, the city lights reflecting in puddles of melted snow. The weight of the warm coat on his shoulders felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just fabric. It was proof that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. For years, Alan had told himself a story. The rich didn't care. The privileged only looked after their own, especially the Trumps. But now he sat in a coat given to him by a Trump himself, and not just any Trump, Barron Trump. The same family he had spent years mocking, blaming, resenting. And yet, Barron hadn't said anything about politics, hadn't judged him, hadn't even hesitated. Alan ran a hand down his scruffy beard, his fingers brushing against the collar of the coat. He thought about throwing it off, tossing it to the side just to prove a point. But his body refused to move, because the truth was, he needed it. And worse, he didn't hate that it had come from Barron. He hated that he might actually owe him something. Alan clenched his jaw, letting out a slow breath. Pride was a dangerous thing. For years, it had kept him from asking for help. It had made him refuse shelter, refuse kindness, refuse to believe that anyone outside his own world could understand his struggle. But Barron hadn't asked him to beg, hadn't asked for anything. He had just given. And now Alan sat there, his body warm for the first time in days, and his beliefs colder than ever. Everything he thought he knew shaken ... And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to feel about it. The city had barely changed. The same biting cold, the same restless energy. But for Barron Trump, something about this night felt different. He wasn't supposed to be back here. This street, this moment, it wasn't planned. But as his SUV slowed at a red light, his eyes flickered toward the same brick wall, the same sidewalk where he had stopped days ago. And then he saw him. Alan. Still there, still hunched against the wall. But this time, something was different. Barron's brows furrowed slightly. The coat was gone. The very same coat Barron had given him to survive the brutal cold. His grip tightened on the armrest. "Pull over," he said. The driver hesitated. "Sir, again, this..." "Just do it." The SUV eased toward the curb. Without waiting, Barron stepped out, the cold slamming into him instantly. He crossed the street, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Alan. The older man looked up just as Barron stopped in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Barron's gaze flickered down. No jacket. Just the same torn hoodie from before. "Where is it?" Barron asked. Alan huffed a short breath, rubbing his frozen hands together. His expression was unreadable. "Didn't think you were coming back," he muttered. Barron didn't move. The coat, what happened to it? A pause. Then, Alan let out a sharp, bitter chuckle. "You really want to know?" he asked, shaking his head. "Fine, I gave it away." Barron's jaw tightened slightly. "You what?" "I gave it to someone else," Alan said, as if it were obvious. His breath was visible in the cold, but he didn't look guilty. Someone who needed it more. Barron stared at him. The air between them grew heavier. "You needed it," Barron said. Alan's eyes darkened. "Yeah, well, I don't take handouts from your kind." Silence. The words hit harder than the cold. Barron inhaled slowly, his breath steady, but inside, something burned. Not anger, disappointment. "You're freezing," Barron said flatly. "And you're telling me you'd rather be cold than take help from me." Alan scoffed. "You think a jacket changes anything? You think that because you threw me some expensive coat, suddenly people like me and people like you are the same?" His voice was sharp, cutting like ice. Barron didn't flinch. "No," he said. "I just think you're too proud to admit you were wrong." Alan's jaw clenched. For the first time in this entire exchange, he had nothing to say. Barron didn't wait for an answer. He turned, stepping back toward the SUV, the wind cutting through his shirt. But just before he opened the door, he stopped, and without looking back, he said, "I'll see you around." Then he got in and drove off. The SUV disappeared into the distance, its taillights fading into the frozen night. Alan sat there, jaw clenched, fists buried deep in his sleeves. His body shivered, but this time, it wasn't just from the cold. Barron's words echoed in his head. "I just think you're too proud to admit you were wrong." Alan wanted to dismiss it, wanted to tell himself it didn't matter, that the kid was just another rich boy trying to play hero. But it wasn't that simple anymore. His fingers tightened around the fabric of his hoodie. The same hoodie he'd been wearing when Barron had first stopped. The same hoodie he was still wearing now. Because the coat, the one thing that had kept him warm, he had given it away. And for what? To prove a point? Alan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong, not about everything, but about one thing. He had spent years believing that people like Barron people with privilege, with wealth, with power would never care. That they would never stop, never notice, never see people like him. But Barron had stopped, twice, not for a camera, not for praise, just because he wanted to help. And Alan had thrown it back in his face. He let out a bitter chuckle, rubbing his hands together, trying to push the thought away, but it wouldn't leave him. He wasn't ready to say he was wrong, not yet, maybe not ever. But as the wind howled through the streets, cutting through his thin clothes, one thing became clear. Barron Trump had left an impact. And no matter how much Alan tried to fight it, he would never forget it. What do you think about Barron Trump's response? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.